Here's the script rewritten for a natural, fluent, and emotionally engaging tone. So, Canada just made a decision about maple syrup. Not a dramatic announcement, not a declaration broadcast live on television, not a retaliatory strike with cameras, flags, or a prime minister at a podium. Instead, it was a quiet, administrative decision, delivered in a single-page policy directive from the Canadian Ministry of Agriculture, co-signed by the Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers. And it shook every major breakfast chain in the United States before most Americans had even finished their morning coffee. IHOP, Denny's, Cracker Barrel, Waffle House, McDonald's, every chain that serves pancakes, waffles, or French toast woke up to a supply chain notification. Their maple syrup allocation had been cut, their procurement contracts were under emergency review, and their input costs were about to change in ways their menus simply weren't built to absorb. And here's the detail that transforms this from a mere breakfast inconvenience into a stark demonstration of the most complete commodity monopoly on Earth. It's a detail most Americans have never been told, and once you hear it, it will change the way you think about maple syrup for the rest of your life. Canada doesn't just produce maple syrup. Canada maintains a strategic maple syrup reserve. This isn't a metaphor or a figure of speech. We're talking about actual warehouses in Quebec, storing millions of pounds of maple syrup in barrels stacked floor to ceiling. These temperature-controlled facilities are managed by a government-backed federation with the legal authority to set production quotas, control prices, and determine who receives supply and who doesn't. Canada treats maple syrup the way Saudi Arabia treats petroleum, as a strategic commodity, to be stockpiled, managed, and deployed according to national interest. And the country that controls this reserve just decided where the syrup goes and where it doesn't. Warren Buffett once called it the purest monopoly in the global food system, explaining that monopolists don't negotiate, don't respond to pressure, and don't worry about competition, because by definition, there is no competition. But it's what Carney said when a reporter asked him what America should do about this maple syrup decision. 10 words, delivered with the calm of a man who knows he holds every card in the deck and doesn't need to show a single one. Those words tell you this decision cannot be challenged, cannot be reversed, and cannot be survived by pretending that corn syrup poured from a bottle shaped like a grandmother is the same thing as what comes from a Canadian sugar maple. When you hear what the decision actually does, why there is no alternative source of real maple syrup anywhere else on Earth, and what it means for every pancake served in America this month, you'll understand why this isn't just about breakfast. This is about what happens when you pick a fight with the only country that makes something the world cannot live without. Hit subscribe because breakfast in America just changed, and the change happened while you were sleeping. Let me take you through what happened overnight, because the speed is what made this so devastating. The decision was released at 4 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern Time, late enough in the day to land after American financial markets had closed, but early enough to be processed by supply chain systems before the next business morning. The document was just 2 pages long. It was written in the dry, technical language of commodity management, allocation percentages, quota adjustments, reserve release protocols. The kind of document that, under normal circumstances, would be read by a dozen trade specialists and filed without comment. But these were not normal circumstances. The document specified a 35% reduction in maple syrup export allocations to the United States, effective within 21 days. It authorized the Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers to release strategic reserve stocks exclusively to priority trade partners, a designation that included the European Union, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and the United Arab Emirates. Conspicuously, it did not include the United States. It directed surplus production to international buyers under preferential multi-year contracts, and it was signed jointly by the Minister of Agriculture and the President of the Federation, signaling that the decision carried the full authority of both the government and the cartel that controls the supply. By 6 o'clock the following morning, procurement teams at every major breakfast chain in the United States were in emergency sessions. The supply chain notifications had arrived overnight, automated alerts from distributors informing purchasing managers that their Canadian maple syrup allocations had been reduced, that replacement supply could not be guaranteed at current prices, and that contracts negotiated in the previous fiscal year were now subject to force majeure review. Within hours, IHOP's parent company had convened an emergency board call. Denny's issued an internal memo to franchise operators, warning of significant near-term input cost increases in syrup-dependent menu categories. Cracker Barrel's procurement team began frantically contacting Vermont producers, the only significant non-Canadian source of real maple syrup, only to be told that Vermont's entire annual output could supply Cracker Barrel's demand for approximately 3 weeks. The scramble was universal, simultaneous, and utterly futile. because every breakfast chain was looking for the same thing at the same time. And the thing they were looking for exists in meaningful commercial quantities in only one place on Earth. But to understand why a single decision from Ottawa can shake an entire American industry overnight, you need to understand something about maple syrup that most people have never been told. Something so extraordinary, so structurally unique, so completely unlike any other food commodity on the planet, that it has no parallel in modern agriculture. Canada produces approximately 73% of the world's maple syrup. Quebec alone, a single province, produces approximately 70% of the global supply. That is not a market share. That is a monopoly, the most complete monopoly of any food product on Earth. And it is a monopoly backed by biology. The sugar maple trees that produce the sap that becomes maple syrup grow in a narrow climatic band, concentrated overwhelmingly in eastern Canada. They cannot be planted in California. They cannot be grown in Brazil. They cannot be cultivated in China. These trees require specific winter conditions, sustained freezing followed by spring thaws that create the pressure differential within the trunk that drives sap flow. That precise combination of conditions exists in commercial density in one region on Earth, and that region is Quebec. The Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers is the institutional embodiment of that monopoly. It is a legal cartel, authorized by the Quebec government to manage every aspect of maple syrup production. This includes the quotas that determine how much each producer can harvest, the minimum prices that prevent market undercutting, and the centralized sales system that channels all production through a single commercial authority. The Federation does not operate like an industry association. It operates like OPEC. It controls supply, it manages pricing, it determines allocation, and critically, it maintains the strategic maple syrup reserve, the physical stockpile of liquid commodity that gives the Federation the ability to stabilize prices during low production years, absorb surpluses during high production years, and, as of this week, redirect supply to preferred buyers during geopolitical confrontations. The strategic reserve is stored in a complex of warehouses in Laurierville, Quebec, a small town whose primary distinction in global commerce is that it houses what may be the most unusual strategic commodity stockpile in the world. At peak capacity, the reserve has held over 100 million pounds of maple syrup in sealed barrels. 100 million pounds. The value of the reserve at current market prices exceeds several $100 million. And the reserve is not a passive storage facility. It is an active instrument of market control, with the Federation's board holding the authority to release stocks, withhold stocks, redirect stocks, and set the terms under which any buyer in the world accesses Canadian maple syrup. The reserve is so valuable, so concentrated, and so critical to the global maple syrup market that it has even been the target of criminal enterprise. In 2012, thieves stole approximately $18 million worth of maple syrup from the reserve in what became known as the Great Canadian Maple Syrup Heist, one of the largest commodity thefts in Canadian history. A heist that only makes sense when you understand that maple syrup is not a quaint agricultural product. It is a strategic commodity controlled by a cartel that operates a reserve. And that cartel just made a decision. Now let me explain exactly what the decision does, because the mechanism is as elegant as it is devastating. The 35% export allocation reduction to the United States means that American buyers, who were previously purchasing Canadian maple syrup on standing contracts, will now receive only 65% of their contracted volume. The remaining 35% has been redirected to international buyers under new preferential agreements that offer below-market pricing in exchange for multi-year volume commitments. The European Union secured the largest share, a 5-year supply agreement that guarantees European buyers access to premium-grade Canadian maple syrup at prices 8% below the current American wholesale rate. Japan and South Korea signed agreements that position Canadian maple syrup as the exclusive premium sweetener in their growing brunch and café culture markets. The United Kingdom, already navigating post-Brexit food supply challenges, signed an agreement that one British food industry executive called the most strategically important food import deal of the decade. The United Arab Emirates secured a smaller but symbolically significant allocation, positioning Canadian maple syrup as a luxury product in Middle Eastern hospitality markets. The reserve release restrictions compound the allocation cuts. Under previous policy, the strategic reserve was available to all buyers during supply shortages, including American buyers. Under the new policy, reserve releases are authorized only for priority trade partners, a designation that requires a bilateral agricultural cooperation agreement that the United States does not currently hold and, given the state of the trade confrontation, cannot currently negotiate. American buyers who experience supply shortfalls due to the allocation cuts simply cannot access reserve stocks to fill the gap. They are, for the first time in the history of the North American maple syrup market, entirely outside the system. And here's where the story gets personal. Because the only alternative to Canadian maple syrup is something every American already knows isn't the same thing. Walk into any IHOP, any Denny's, any Waffle House in America, and ask for maple syrup with your pancakes. What arrives at your table is, in most cases, not maple syrup. It is pancake syrup, a blend of corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup, artificial maple flavoring, caramel coloring, and in some formulations, 2 to 5% real maple syrup for labeling purposes. Most Americans have been eating flavored corn syrup on their pancakes their entire lives and calling it maple syrup. That is the current reality for the mass market breakfast chains. But the crisis does not end there. Because the chains that have positioned themselves around authenticity, around real ingredients, around the premium breakfast experience, are the ones that absolutely cannot survive on corn syrup. They have built their brand on the word real. Their menus say pure maple syrup. Their marketing says authentic. And authenticity cannot be faked with corn syrup without utterly destroying the brand promise that justifies the premium price. For the premium market, high-end restaurants, specialty food retailers, artisanal brands, farmers market producers, there is no alternative at all. Real maple syrup has a flavor profile that is biochemically unique. It contains over 200 naturally occurring compounds that produce its characteristic taste, compounds that cannot be synthesized, cannot be replicated, and cannot be approximated by any combination of artificial flavoring and corn syrup. Anyone who has ever tasted real maple syrup on a pancake and then tasted corn-based pancake syrup on the same pancake knows this in their body before their brain confirms it. They are not the same product. They are not even close to the same product. One is a natural food with a complex flavor produced by a living tree over the course of a season. The other is processed corn sweetener with artificial flavoring. The market for real maple syrup is the market for something that only Canada produces. And Canada just decided to send it somewhere else. And when a reporter asked Carney what America should do about the maple syrup decision, at a press conference in Quebec City, standing in front of a display of maple syrup barrels that looked more like a wine cellar than a trade policy event, his response was 10 words that compressed the entire monopoly into its simplest, most inescapable terms. The reporter from CNN asked, "Prime Minister, American breakfast chains are calling this an act of economic warfare. What alternatives does the United States have?" Carney looked at the reporter with the expression that had become his signature throughout the trade confrontation. Not anger, not defiance, not the forced composure of a leader under pressure, but the genuine relaxation of someone who holds a position so dominant that pressure is simply not something he experiences. He said, "It's not a negotiation, it's a menu, and we wrote it." 10 words, 3 sentences. The first sentence denies the framework. This is not a situation where two parties bargain. The second sentence introduces the metaphor. Menu refers simultaneously to the breakfast chain menus that are about to change and to the limited options available to the United States. The third sentence claims authorship. "We wrote it" is the monopolist's declaration that the terms belong to the supplier, not the buyer. The calm was devastating precisely because it was earned. Carney was not performing composure, he was simply describing reality. When you control 73% of the global supply of a product for which no substitute exists, you don't need to perform anything, you just state the facts. Within 15 minutes, the quote was trending in 9 countries. Within an hour, it was the headline on Bloomberg, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the BBC, and every Canadian newspaper. One trade commentator called it the most concise expression of monopoly power ever delivered by a political leader. The breakfast chains whose menus he was referencing declined to comment. And here's why. There is no countermove. Not because countermoves are expensive, not because they take time, but because, in the most literal sense, they do not exist. A tariff on Canadian maple syrup would raise the price for American consumers and businesses, punishing the buyer for the supplier's decision without restoring a single drop of supply. Subsidizing American maple syrup production, primarily in Vermont, New York, and New Hampshire, would take decades, because you cannot grow a sugar maple tree. The trees take 30 to 40 years to reach productive maturity. You cannot plant a forest in January and tap it in March. Biology does not respond to executive orders. Investing in synthetic maple flavoring doesn't solve the premium market problem, because the premium market specifically demands real maple syrup and will not accept a synthetic substitute. Importing from other producing nations, the United States itself produces some maple syrup, and there are small operations in Japan and South Korea, amounts to supplementing 73% market dominance with fractions of a percent. It's a rounding error pretending to be a strategy. The monopoly position means that Canada doesn't respond to market forces. Canada is the market force. When the Federation sets prices, those are the prices. When the Federation sets quotas, those are the quotas. When the Federation decides who receives supply from the strategic reserve, those are the recipients. There is no alternative market. There is no competitive supplier waiting in the wings. There is no new technology that can produce maple syrup without maple trees. The monopoly is backed by biology, managed by a cartel, stabilized by a strategic reserve, and as of this week, weaponized by a policy directive that redirected 35% of the American supply to international buyers who were happy to take it. This is what absolute market control looks like. And absolute market control does not negotiate, it decides. Warren Buffett's response addressed this structural reality with the reverence of someone who had spent 7 decades searching for exactly the kind of competitive advantage that Canada holds in maple syrup, and who recognized it immediately as the purest expression of monopoly power in the modern food system. He didn't talk about trade policy. He didn't talk about Trump or Carney or the political dimensions. He talked about the concept that had made him the most successful investor in American history: pricing power. And he explained why Canadian maple syrup represents its most perfect form. In 70 years of investing, Buffett said, I have looked for one thing above all else: pricing power. The ability to raise your price and not lose customers. That is the ultimate test of a competitive position. And Canadian maple syrup has the most absolute pricing power of any food commodity on earth, because there is no alternative. Not a worse alternative, not an expensive alternative. No alternative. You either buy Canadian maple syrup or you don't buy maple syrup. That is a monopoly in its purest form, and monopolies don't negotiate, they decide. He drew the structural parallel with his own portfolio. I've always said I'd rather own a monopoly than a brilliant business in a competitive market. A brilliant business in a competitive market has to keep being brilliant. A monopoly just has to exist. Canadian maple syrup doesn't need to innovate. It doesn't need to market. It doesn't need to compete. It needs to exist. And as long as sugar maple trees grow in Quebec and don't grow in meaningful numbers anywhere else, it will exist. That is a moat that cannot be crossed. Not because it's wide, but because it's biological. He extended the analysis to the reserve system. The strategic maple syrup reserve is the most fascinating commodity management instrument I've come across in my career. It is OPEC's model applied to a food product with even less competition than oil. Oil has alternatives: natural gas, solar, wind, nuclear. Maple syrup has no alternative. The reserve gives Canada the ability to manage global pricing with a precision that even OPEC cannot achieve, because OPEC must coordinate among multiple sovereign producers, each with their own interests. The Federation coordinates a single province's output through a single authority. It is monopoly management perfected. His closing was delivered with the quiet weight of a verdict from the highest court of capitalism. When there's only one seller, the seller doesn't negotiate. The seller decides. Canada decided. And the American breakfast industry just learned what every buyer in a monopoly market learns eventually. The terms aren't yours to set. And the consequences hit breakfast tables across America before the White House even had a response. Wholesale maple syrup prices spiked 23% within the first 2 weeks, a supply-driven increase that immediately cascaded into retail pricing across every channel. Restaurant chains implementing price adjustments on pancake and waffle categories reported average menu price increases of 8 to 15%, with premium-positioned chains that featured real maple syrup facing even steeper adjustments. IHOP issued a statement to franchise operators acknowledging near-term cost pressures in syrup-dependent menu items and authorizing regional price adjustments at operator discretion. Denny's announced it was evaluating all sweetener sourcing options, language that industry analysts interpreted as preparation for a potential shift from real maple syrup to corn-based alternatives in some menu applications. A move that would save costs but risk brand perception in a market where real and authentic have become defining competitive differentiators. The broader food manufacturing sector absorbed the shock across categories that most Americans had never associated with maple syrup. Maple syrup is not just a breakfast condiment. It is an ingredient in granola, in yogurt, in baked goods, in marinades, in craft cocktails, in specialty coffee drinks, in energy bars, and in health food products marketed to consumers who have specifically chosen real maple syrup as a healthier alternative to refined sugar and high-fructose corn syrup. The health food industry, a sector that has grown exponentially over the past decade on the promise of clean labels, natural ingredients, and transparent sourcing, was among the hardest hit, because its entire value proposition rests on ingredients that cannot be substituted without destroying the product's market positioning. A clean label granola sweetened with real maple syrup is a premium health food. The same granola sweetened with corn syrup is a conventional packaged good, competing on price with products that have a decades-long cost advantage. The maple syrup decision didn't just threaten breakfast, it threatened the fastest-growing segment of the American food industry, the segment built on the word real, by removing the very ingredient that made real, real. Cracker Barrel, the chain most culturally identified with authentic American breakfast and real maple syrup, faced the sharpest strategic dilemma. Its brand promise was built around nostalgia, tradition, and genuine ingredients. Replacing real maple syrup with corn-based alternatives would save money in the short term, but destroy the brand positioning that justified its premium pricing in the long term. A Cracker Barrel executive, speaking anonymously because they were not authorized to discuss supply chain strategy publicly, said, "Our customers come to us because we serve real food. Real maple syrup is part of that promise. If we switch to corn syrup, we're not Cracker Barrel anymore. We're just another chain with cheaper ingredients. But if we don't switch, our margins disappear. This isn't a sourcing problem. This is an identity crisis." The quote captured something that no supply chain analysis could. The moment when a trade dispute reaches into the cultural DNA of an American institution and forces a choice between authenticity and survival. The White House response revealed the peculiar helplessness of a government that had grown accustomed to responding to Canadian trade moves with tariff threats and social media tirades, but that had no playbook for a monopoly simply exercising its market power. Trump's initial reaction, according to reports from inside the administration, was dismissive. "It's syrup." A response that lasted approximately 40 minutes until the trade team briefed him on the monopoly structure, the strategic reserve, the Federation's cartel authority, and the fact that no domestic alternative existed at any meaningful scale. The briefing reportedly included a chart showing Canada's 73% market share, alongside a list of every American breakfast chain affected, and the projected menu price increases each chain would be forced to implement. The president's follow-up question, "Why don't we just make our own?" was answered with a single data point. Sugar maple trees require 30 to 40 years to reach productive maturity. The room was quiet after that. The White House issued a statement 24 hours later, calling the decision an unnecessary escalation and promising a comprehensive review of American agricultural self-sufficiency. Language that acknowledged the dependency without proposing a solution, because no solution that could be implemented within a presidential term, or even within a generation, existed. The domestic political response fractured along lines that followed neither party nor region, but something more primal: the relationship between Americans and their breakfast. Consumer anger when it arrived was not ideological, it was not partisan. It was the universal, bipartisan, demographically comprehensive fury of people who had just been told that their pancakes were about to get more expensive, or worse, less authentic. Polling conducted within 10 days showed that 68% of Americans were unaware that Canada controlled over 70% of the global maple syrup supply before the crisis. 72% said the crisis made them less confident in the government's understanding of American food dependencies. And 59%, a majority that crossed every party line, every income bracket, every geographic region, said that the trade war was making everyday life more expensive without making America stronger. The breakfast table had done what policy papers, editorial boards, and opposition politicians could not. It had made the trade war personal, visible, and undeniable, every morning, on every plate, in every home. Vermont's maple syrup producers, the largest domestic producers whose annual output represents approximately 5% of Canadian volume, experienced the paradox of being simultaneously celebrated and overwhelmed. Demand for Vermont syrup surged as buyers desperate for non-Canadian supply flooded the market, but Vermont's production capacity is structurally limited by the number of productive sugar maples in the state, which cannot be meaningfully increased in any time frame shorter than a generation. Vermont producers, who had been selling their syrup at premium artisanal prices, were now being offered industrial-scale contracts they simply could not fill. One Vermont producer described the situation with the weary humor of someone who had been asked to fill the ocean with a garden hose. "Everyone wants Vermont maple syrup now. We're flattered, but we produce enough to supply America for about 11 days. After that, you're back to calling Quebec." International buyers who had secured preferential access to Canadian maple syrup celebrated the agreements as both commercial wins and cultural acquisitions. Japan's adoption of real maple syrup into its expanding brunch and cafe culture was described by Japanese food industry analysts as the most significant Western food import integration since the adoption of Western-style bread in the post-war era. European specialty food retailers reported that Canadian maple syrup had been repositioned from a niche import to a mainstream premium product, with projected sales increases of 30 to 40% in the first year of the new supply agreements. The global maple syrup market, previously invisible to most consumers and policymakers, was being restructured in real time, with Canada at the center and the United States increasingly at the margins of a commodity it had always assumed would be available, affordable, and unconditionally supplied. So here's where we stand. Canada made a single policy decision, a two-page directive released at 4 in the afternoon, written in the dry language of commodity management, that reduced American maple syrup allocations by 35%, restricted strategic reserve access to preferred international partners, and redirected surplus production to buyers in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East under multi-year contracts. Wholesale prices spiked 23%. Breakfast chains convened emergency boards. Cracker Barrel faced an identity crisis. Vermont was asked to replace 73% of the global supply with 5% of it. And Mark Carney stood in Quebec City in front of a wall of maple syrup barrels and said 10 words that are now on the front page of every business publication in the world. It's not a negotiation, it's a menu, and we wrote it. Buffett explained why there is no countermove with the authority of someone who has spent 70 years studying the difference between competitive markets and monopolies. When there's only one seller, the seller doesn't negotiate. The seller decided. Canada decided. The monopoly is backed by biology. The trees grow where they grow and nowhere else. The monopoly is managed by a cartel. The Federation controls production, pricing, and allocation. The monopoly is stabilized by a strategic reserve, millions of pounds stored in Quebec warehouses, released at the Federation's discretion. And the monopoly is now weaponized by a policy directive that told the largest economy in the world, "Your breakfast runs through our province. It always has. And from now on, we decide the terms." Can American breakfast chains survive a 23% increase in their most iconic ingredient? And if they can't, what happens to the pancake, the waffle, and the French toast that define the American breakfast experience? Can domestic production in Vermont, New York, and New Hampshire meaningfully replace a supply that represents less than 1/5 of Canadian output? And if it can't, how long are Americans willing to accept corn syrup dressed in a grandmother-shaped bottle as a substitute for the real thing? And the question that should follow every American from the breakfast table to the ballot box: if the most ordinary meal of the day, the meal that starts every morning, the meal that defines comfort, the meal that carries the weight of childhood memory and family tradition, can be disrupted overnight by a two-page decision from a country most Americans think of as polite and unthreatening, what else in daily American life depends on a supply chain that runs through a nation the United States decided to treat as an adversary rather than a neighbor? Canada didn't attack. Canada didn't threaten. Canada didn't retaliate. Canada made a decision the way a monopolist makes a decision, calmly, administratively, without drama, without ultimatums, without any of the theatrical escalation that has defined the American side of this confrontation. The decision was 2 pages long. It was released at 4 in the afternoon. It was written in the language of commodity management. And it shook the American breakfast industry overnight. Not because it was aggressive, but because it was quiet, because it was final, and because there is no alternative supplier, no substitute product, no domestic backup, no emergency reserve on the American side, no plan B of any kind, except the corn syrup that everybody knows isn't maple syrup and never will be. Carney didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to make a speech. He didn't need to look into a camera and deliver a line designed to trend. He just needed to sign a 2-page document. Because when you're the only seller of something the world can't do without, you don't need rhetoric, you need a pen. And the menu. The menu of options available to the United States. The menu of alternatives. The menu of countermoves and contingencies and escape routes was written in Ottawa, in 2 pages, in the language of a country that knows exactly what it has and exactly what it's worth. And every breakfast table in America is the proof.